in 1925 and 26, the Chinese Communist Party more or less tasked members of the party, most importantly Mao Zedong, to undertake what the title of this suggests, an analysis of classes, the class structure of Chinese society. And so the basic notion here is, in order for us to undertake and prepare for the eventuality and the inevitability of class conflict in China, so thinking beyond the United Front to the future, we need to know the structure of society. We need to know the economic structure of our society, and more importantly, we need to have a dynamic sense of who's going to do what when bleep hits the fan. Like, who is going to, which constituent elements of society are going to dig in their heels and fight us to the death? Which ones are going to kind of capitulate and melt, or which groups are going to split up internally and basically cease to be a group, and almost some will go with the bourgeois landlords and some will come with our leftist intellectuals. It's really wargaming out of what communist revolution or class warfare in China might look like. And very importantly is that Mao Zedong in 1926 is really totally aligned with orthodoxy at this point. And I think I have a few quotes for you here. Yeah. 1926, this is from analysis of classes in Chinese society. Though not very numerous, the industrial proletariat represents China's new productive forces, is the most progressive class in modern China, and has become the leading force in the revolutionary movement. So the urban is the thing, the industrial proletariat is the thing. So there is very little daylight between Mao Zedong at this point and kind of conventional Moscow-driven orthodoxy. And what's interesting about this is, not very long from now, Mao will undertake a sea change in his thinking about this. And then he will become one of the leading advocates later on of a agrarian-focused communism. But at this point, he's not there. So he's still a very derivative, one might call him a derivative thinker. Now, this is interesting. This is, we're not going to, this isn't a course on Russian history, but you can actually read the debates between Stalin and Trotsky. And they're fascinating. So Stalin is trying to explain why this alliance is actually progressive. It's a progressive act to align the Chinese Communist Party with a bourgeois nationalist organization, meaning the Chinese nationalists. And Trotsky, on the other hand, you don't need to worry about this in particular, but Trotsky, on the other hand, will argue just the opposite. Let me see if I can come back there. Sorry about that. Let me go back. He'll say that, in fact, this exposes the Chinese communists. This is going to come back to haunt us in the end. And you have to think about this. I mean, thus far we've talked about all of the various foreign powers who see China in one way, shape, or form as like a market to be penetrated. The merchants see it literally as a market to be penetrated. Christian missionaries saw it as like a market of souls to be penetrated. And now the Soviets see it as a market of revolutionaries to be penetrated, of potential revolutionaries. So so that 2020, we're still living in this idea of China as this ever, potential this, potential that, potential this, potential consumers, potential souls for Christ, potential comrades for communist revolution. This fetishization of the possibility of China takes on many varieties. We don't often think of missionaries and hardcore communists in the same sentence, but we really can. Now, from the perspective of the CCP, there was a lot in the early phase, 1940, 1924, 25, 26. Arguably, Stalin was right, because during this period of time, technically speaking, the Chinese communists were not supposed to agitate as communists. They were supposed to agitate as part of a unified political entity. this united front. And they were not supposed to, when they went out and passed out leaflets or undertook sabotage or undertook, infiltration, they weren't supposed to be getting members for the Chinese Communist Party, but they were. And so, it's kind of like, if you're a small company and you get bought out by a big company, you're supposed to like serve the interest of that big, your new parent company. But theoretically, you could also like build up your MailChimp mailing list for yourself as well. And so that's what happens. Like the CCP MailChimp listserv explodes during this period. Its membership in 1924-25 is totally negligible. But by 1927, on the eve of the betrayal by the Nationalists, it is exploding. And in fact, this is one of the contributing factors to Chiang Kai-shek's growing unease about the Chinese Communists. It's not just that they're growing members. They are, in fact, undertaking in urban insurrection. They are undertaking things as a political organization, theoretically under the umbrella of this united front. So, just from the perspective of the CCP, the United Front period was a major boon to its growth. And arguably, without the United Front, the Chinese Communist Party would never have grown at this velocity. So, at this moment, Stalin is kind of, correct. However, this brings us back to what's happening in the Nationalist Party. So Sun Yat-sen will pass away of natural causes in 1925. He'll die of cancer. And what will follow is a power struggle between two men. Really, it's two contenders for the political leadership of the party. And this is Wang Jingwei, who we will come to know later as the peasant of China, because we'll come to that, and Chiang Kai-shek. Now, as I alluded to before, there are very discernible, potent leftist leanings and sensibilities in Sun Yat-sen's writing and thinking. Wang Jingwei shares these. There is Chiang Kai-shek does not. So one thing that's happening is an internal schism in the Chinese Nationalist Party between a kind of leftist, not communist, but sort of left side of the party and more of a right side of the party, each represented by these two individuals. Well, at the end of the day, it is Chiang Kai-shek that will prove victorious, and yet the left-leaning side of the Nationalist Party will continue to survive and exist. So here is a picture of one of the Song sisters, Song Qingling, with Mao. There were, so the famous three sisters whose husbands included Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek. That there are very, very strong concerns, leanings, outright sympathies with socialism and communism in the Nationalist Party. But with the power struggle, the way it turns out, this will become more or less a minority voice within the Nationalist Party. So this is going to be very important, because it is the nationalists and the communists who are undertaking the Northern Expedition, but in another way, one might say that it is largely the more right-leaning, if not just outright rightist nationalists and the Chinese communists who are the key players in this. And this is where the growing tension between these two parties is emerging. Chiang Kai-shek does not share these sensibilities. He's watching the membership registers of the CCP grow. He's watching as the CCP undertakes attempted urban insurrections in various Chinese cities. And this is something that he himself opposes, vehemently. The culmination of this growing schism, and as an outgrowth, really, of the power struggle, and after Sun's death, the rise of Chiang Kai-shek, the leftist party more or less becoming a kind of minority voice within the Nationalist Party, culminates in the White Terror. And this is during the Long March. So the Chinese communists, they're playing a variety of roles in the long. I'm sorry. Whoa, back up. The Northern Expedition. They're playing a variety of roles in the Northern Expedition. They are advanced kind of more or less sort of psychological warfare, infiltration, building up underground networks in advance of the arrival of nationalist military forces, varieties of things. But it is at one moment in the Northern Expedition, when things are going really well on the whole, that in April 1927, Chiang Kai-shek will order a complete about-face and an outright assault on the erstwhile allies, the Chinese communists. And this includes just the large-scale massacre of Chinese communists in Shanghai, and also in other urban areas under nationalist control by this point. And then that will extend into the incarceration, if not execution without trial, of those suspected to be trade union leaders or leftist intellectuals. And then this will also extend in more or less like a manhunt into surrounding rural areas to try to root out Chinese communism. So this is the first moment in which the Chinese communists face potential annihilation, potential extermination. And this is only 6 years into its existence as a party. They do survive, but the urban infrastructure is lost. There are remnants of it, but eventually they will eventually, in a few years' time, they will abandon Shanghai outright as a center of their headquarters, although they will maintain underground cells in a variety of urban areas. But the urban areas are kind of are places of great peril for them from this moment on. Now, what is the outcome of the Northern Expedition? On the one hand, the Northern Expedition was a time of pitched battle and brutal military engagements. People describe the fields just bathed in blood and bodies after major battles between nationalist forces and various warlord forces. But at the same time, it was also a process of buying warlords off, and buying them off, giving them very high ranks within a government to be, and also more or less de facto allowing them to maintain their regional power, and really living to fight another day and kicking the can down the street about how we are actually going to undertake the re-centralization of power. So 1927, technically speaking, in the timeline of Chinese history, is understood as the beginning of the so-called Nanjing Decade, 1927 to 1937, i.e. the outbreak of war with Japan. And technically speaking, Nanjing is now the capital of a unified government, of a unified China. That unification is paper thin, however. And people understand this and realize that the real job of centralizing power around Nanjing, around the Nationalist Party, is going to take many years, and in fact, many, many more battles with these. So this is a personnel list of the Nanjing government in 1927. And you can see handsome Chiang Kai-shek here. He's a very handsome man. But you can also see some of the other people here. So Yan Xishan, who was a major warlord, becomes Minister of the Interior. Then you have Li Zongren, who's a very, very important leader in Hankou. Then you have another very important leader given a place and position in government. Then you have one of the most powerful warlords in the north, made Minister of War, Feng Yuxiang. And the list goes on. Oh, and Wang Jingwei, the kind of, again, more or less the political leader of the left faction of the nationalists, is made president of the Judicial Council. So this is a really internally fractured central government. So its stability is really paper thin here. The White Terror is the beginning according to most historians and sort of periodizations of the peasant stage or the agrarian turn in Chinese communism. And in essence, urban areas are no longer within reach because of the actions of the nationalists following the spring of 1927. And so there's a retreat from urban areas, and this is not guided by ideology. It's purely acts of survival. However, it's very important to know that this entire time there have been many activists, organizers operating in rural areas. So one of the great questions that has been in play since certainly during the New Culture movement, but even in the late Qing, was the question of rural poverty and of education levels and literacy and looking out onto the sort of global stage and witnessing mass involvement in politics or mass education or mass conscript armies. So things that involve and require organization of non-elite society, and the question of what are we going to do. And so it is true that, you know, during this period we have the mainstay of the Chinese Communist Party, which is still a small organization, focused on urban areas. But this isn't to say that there aren't organizations that are focused on the countryside. So what's going to happen is, in a certain sense, the Chinese Communist Party is going to discover a lot of what's going on already by those who are attempting to alleviate poverty, to lower rents, to attempt to redistribute land, attempt to check the power of landowners and landlords, promote literacy, promote public hygiene, and various other campaigns in the countryside. And there's really a sort of discovery process that happens with these once urban-based elite, where they start to discover the Chinese countryside. And since the Chinese countryside is more or less China, because it's just overwhelmingly an agrarian country at this moment, this is really the discovery of China in a certain sense, or the majority of China. And so we need to be very careful that everything we're about to discuss is not the invention of de novo, from nothing, of these once Shanghai-based urban elite, but rather a kind of a discovery of some of the things that are already going on in the countryside, and then the reconceptualization of a distinctly Chinese branch of socialism, global communism, that takes the countryside as its center of operations. So this is 1927 to 1934, really all the way to 1937, one might say. And there are going to be a variety of places that will be called headquarters at this point. And these are first Jingangshan, and second the Jiangxi Soviet. And I'll show you some maps of these. But what you need to know about these places is these are not holiday destinations. These are rugged, hard to reach, often poor parts of the countryside that are in fact chosen as headquarters, as bases of operation, precisely because they are so difficult. They would be so difficult for the nationalists to easily infiltrate and destroy. So what I want you to have in your mind is, you know, escaped slaves in the South retreating into the marshes and trying to take refuge and set up headquarters there, or of the same kinds of things of escaped slaves in Jamaica running into the highlands, or of this is a survival strategy that one sees in many, many parts of the world when one is up against a profoundly more powerful foe, that one attempts to use geography as an environment, as a source of support. So Jingangshan, this mountainous region, is a very, very rough region, and that's on purpose. That's on purpose that it's chosen in that way. And really, every base area from this moment all the way to the 1940s, to the late 1940s, will be these very rugged terrain kind of areas. Very importantly, however, although I list these two locations, Jingangshan from 1927-29, Jiangxi Soviet 31 to 34, these are just the largest of a number of base areas. So one of the new strategies of the Chinese Communist Party in this retreat into the countryside was the development of these so-called base areas. And there are pockets of these all over the country, most of them sort of attempting to be beyond the reach of the nationalists militarily, but some of them actually more or less kind of underground cells. And the Jingangshan and Jiangxi Soviet are merely the kind of headquarter base area. And this is very important because this is a move, this is going to be a foreshadowing, one could say, of a new mode of military action that's going to become central to Chinese communist strategy here on out, and that is guerrilla warfare or asymmetric warfare. So these base areas can, under times of relative stability or peace, they can communicate with each other, and they can, they can take their orders from the base area, but they can also operate independently. They can also operate autonomously when they're cut off from one another. And so there is a great deal of autonomy and acephalousness, headlessness to this organization at this point, really out of survival, out of necessity. So that's one thing to sort of keep in mind. It's also at this point when the Chinese communists will, in a certain sense, the White Terror is the we will never forget moment of Chinese communist history. Never again will we be defenseless. We entered into the United Front. We had no military to speak of. We had no, we had no constabulary to speak of, no police force to speak of. We were operating under a certain set of assumptions that, their military was my military, our military, and that proved to be a very deadly assumption. And so it's from this moment on when there is a commitment by the Chinese communists to build an army. And this is the origins of the Chinese Red Army. So we are never going to be defenseless ever again. I don't have a picture of Mao actually in Jingangshan. I think I could find one eventually, but this is an actor playing Mao Zedong in a movie about Jingangshan, and that will just have to suffice. That guy does not look like Mao at all, but he's trying. Now, the main base area, Jingangshan, is a very short-lived base area. The really important one for our purposes is the base area in southern eastern China in the province of Jiangxi, hence the Jiangxi Soviet. And here, the Soviet, as patterned after this political concept in the Soviet Union, implies a political state, a state-like polity. This is no longer a party. This is about a territory, a government. And so the idea here is the formation in this very rough and tumble place to form a government, to form a state. And so there is a currency system in the Jiangxi Soviet. There is a tax system. There is a military. There's sort of political symbolism. This is an attempt to form a state inside the state of China, and to defend it, against the onslaughts of the nationalists. And it's during this point when Mao Zedong will undergo a very important transformation, both for himself and for the trajectory of Chinese communism, the history of Chinese communism, and the history of China more broadly. And this is a reorientation towards the agrarian and the rural. And so if we just contrast these two essays, I already showed you before analysis on classes in Chinese society, 1926, when he just sounds like an orthodox kind of urban industrialist communist. But later, in 1927, just a year later, he writes this, what is now one of the most famous documents in modern Chinese history, a report of an investigation of a peasant uprising in Hunan. Hunan being Hunan province, the province where he is from, he was born in. And the story goes a little bit like this. There was a local uprising that the Chinese communists in Jiangxi had nothing to do with. It was a spontaneously organized and operated uprising that took place in this region of Hunan. Sorry, this is the quote from before. Let me move ahead a little bit. Okay, and it managed to seize control of a territory of a village, and to incarcerate landlords, and then to undertake, in essence, a trial of the landlords, a seizure of the landlord's land and documents, and then to set about systematically trying to reapportion land based upon a kind of analysis of the structure of the local town, and of the sort of documentation that they seized. And the details here are less important than the notion of this, that contrary, and this is what Mao is right. Mao is basically going there in the wake of the rebellion as an anthropologist, an ethnographer, a sociologist. He goes there and he wants to know, how did they do it? What exactly did you do? Like, when you seized the landlords, what did you do next? And then he also undertook basically an economic sociology of the village. He says, who owns what land? What are the main livestock? What are the main sources of income? How many pigs does this family own? How many pigs who rose up first? Who opposed it? What happened here? And he's doing an ethnography of rural revolution in China. And he writes a report on it. Basically, it's like a summary of what he learned about how this uprising took place in this village in Hunan. And the conclusion he arrives at, and this is very important, is that our understanding of peasants is wrong. Peasants are not superstitious country bumpkin fools who are destined to be dragged behind us urban intellectuals like dead weights on the march towards, communist utopia. They are actually ahead of us. They are better at this than us. And he goes through all the different elements of what these peasant rebels, these peasant uprising, what they did. And he said, these guys didn't just march into the landlord's home and butcher the family. They didn't just sort of, have a free-for-all where they tried to gobble up various property or land. They actually incarcerated the landlord and then subjected him to more or less a trial, and then undertook a systematic attempt to reapportion the landowners in some sort of rational way to landless peasants and poor peasants in the region, by which I mean, and they, unlike us, kind of pale-skinned, lily-livered, urban intellectual professor types, are willing to perform violence. And they understand, this is sort of the summary still, they understand that revolution fundamentally is an inherently violent act. This is the moment, this essay, if anyone has ever heard the famous quote, that revolution is not a dinner party. This is the essay where that comes from. And he says, he's not the one who's saying this. He's saying the peasants are the ones who understand this better than we do. So in a counterintuitive flip, they are our teachers in some sense. We have a lot to teach them, but they are our teachers. and they behave like accountants, they behave like judges, they behave like reformers. In fact, they are the ones that are themselves going out amongst themselves and trying to get people to stop believing in fanciful superstition and irrational things. They're the ones doing it, and we can learn from them. So in essence, he sees this case in Hunan, among others, as a possible template for how we could actually foment revolution in China. That maybe the model should not come from Manchester, England, or like, the industrial towns in Germany, but should come from villages in Hunan. So it's a very, very different model of how revolution could happen. I won't go into this, but he lists all their achievements. You can read this. This is online. And he even talks about their techniques of violence. And one of the techniques of violence that he did not invent, the Chinese communists didn't invent, Chinese peasants invented, was marching landlords through town wearing conical paper hats as a form of public humiliation. We will see that again. We will see it in the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution, the forms of violence that are deployed in the Cultural Revolution, not all of them, but many of them, were not invented by the Chinese communists. They were invented by everyday Chinese peasants. They were systematized by the Chinese communists, because the Chinese communists actually did an ethnography of how revolution actually takes place, not in theory but in practice, and then attempted to systematize that. Okay, and this is the famous quote. We can take a second to read this. A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence, by which one class overthrows another. A rural revolution is a revolution by which the peasantry overthrows the power of the feudal landlord class. Without using the greatest force, the peasants cannot possibly overthrow the deep-rooted authority of the landlords, which has lasted for thousands of years. So I want you to think back to earlier stuff about May 4th, and May 4th forms of critique, and I talked about how people were saying, if we really analyze how marriage happens here, marriage bears similarity to prostitution and to rape. That's a form of critique, is saying, if we really x-ray its structure, this is what it is. And then there's this other thing in society that we don't like, and we take an x-ray of it. We put one on top of the other, and wow, we got a match. This essay is still in that genealogy, because what he's saying here is, I'm not claiming or arguing that revolution needs to be violent. It is violent. That is what it is. And they understand it, meaning the peasants. They understand this, and they know, intrinsically they know, things that we have to study in order to understand. Like, think of Lu Xun, and think of Diary of a Madman, and think of, On Literary Revolution, and people like Chen Duxiu saying, there are basically kind of prisons in our mind because of the way that our language actually operates. And so of course the 1911 revolution didn't work, because we're still imprisoned by culture, and we need to overthrow culture, and this culture is thousands of years old, and how are we going to do it? And we feel so smart saying all this stuff, we intellectuals, but they actually get it. They understand that landlords have controlled society for centuries, for over a millennium. And so, no, they cannot walk into the landlord's home and talk with them. They intrinsically understand something that we struggle to understand and that we debate. They are our models. but this is not to say that the Soviet Union and Moscow doesn't still exercise quite a lot of influence. Moscow is really worried after the White Terror, and in fact, Trotsky around that time is basically saying, "See ya," like "told you so" to Stalin. Like, this is what I said was going to happen, and they've lost connection. Obviously, there's no headquarters in Shanghai the way there was. And so Stalin and the Soviet Union are desperately trying to get their gimbal straight and get connection back and get control again and influence again over what's happening in China. And they try to do this in 1931 by sending this dispatch of Moscow-trained Chinese communists to the base area to more or less reassert control and reassert orthodoxy and Moscow's influence. And these are the so-called returned student faction, or the 28 Bolsheviks. And so this is the power struggle that one of the earliest power struggles is between Mao and his kind of circle and figures like Wang Ming and these other Moscow deployed people who had very increasingly divergent visions of how this is supposed to play out. Well, and let's skip ahead here a little bit. The Chinese nationalists, this is the Nanjing decade now, and their goal is centralization. And now suddenly, not only do we have the warlords, the former warlords, to try to centralize and disarm, but now we have this state inside our state. We have an ungoverned region, the Jiangxi Soviet, that needs to be retaken. And so one of the efforts by the Chinese nationalists are what are known as encirclement campaigns. These are campaigns whose goal is to, the goal of this is not a peace treaty. The goal of this is wholesale extermination and slaughter. So this will be the second attempt by Chiang Kai-shek, the first being the White Terror, the second attempt to annihilate the Chinese communists by destroying the base area in Jiangxi. And just if you look at the sort of military statistics here, it's pretty staggering. One campaign after the next, each of them delivering, death and destruction to the Jiangxi Soviet, but not destroying it. And each one increasingly ferocious and large scale. So by the fourth and fifth campaigns, we have World War II level deployment of troops to the south to try and destroy the base areas. Eventually, the base area will be determined to be unsalvageable, that we can't stay here any longer. And the campaign, the reason they're called encirclement campaigns is because the technique is quite literally the formation of a perimeter with bunkers or blockhouses that then allow nothing to pass, and then to move to reduce the perimeter, to reduce the diameter of that encirclement, of that circle, until such point that nothing gets out and everything inside is killed. And so the question here is how are we going to survive this? And ultimately, it's determined in secret by high-level leadership of the Chinese communists in the Jiangxi Soviet. So this would include Mao Zedong, his family, his sort of high-level Politburo members, but not the rank and file, that we are going to attempt to stage a breakout of the encirclement and try to get out of here. And we're going to leave behind thousands of people to be slaughtered. And that could be interpreted as completely heartless. The other side of this is quite literally, there is no way we're going to get everyone out of here. And the only chance for any of us to get out of here is if this is done in some sort of clandestine fashion. The encirclement is broken, and that goes down in sort of Chinese communist lore as one of the main revolutionary moments, the breaking of the encirclement. That's like something that operas have been written about. But this is the beginning of the Long March. And I know everyone has heard of the Long March. The Long March now is celebrated as this, heroic chapter in Chinese communist history. And certainly there are many moments of heroism. But what it is a bloody military retreat. That's what it is. It is a desperate attempt to escape a far superior military force on foot across often nearly impassable terrain while being shot at. And if you calculate it, these 5,600 miles, what does that mean? It means walking from Stanford University to my alma mater of Columbia University, and then walking all the way back to UCLA while being shot at. That's the Long March. So sort of death be not proud. It later becomes this folkloric thing, but at the time there's nothing folkloric about it. It's pure survival. So this is the second moment in which the Chinese Communist Party could have been destroyed completely. If you see what I'm getting at here, like I'm trying to really underscore just like how historically improbable the Chinese Communist victory in 1949 was. I hope that's coming across. We see a party that was barely, barely a glorified study group in 1921, then was nearly exterminated 6 years later, then was nearly exterminated another, less than a decade later. And then Chiang Kai-shek is going to try to destroy them more, and then the Japanese are going to get involved. And if Chiang Kai-shek is anti-communist, the Japanese military is even more anti-communist. So just how this pans out is one of the sort of central questions, really, of the 20th century. But it's here on the Long March in a conference along the way, one of these moments, a rare moment of peace where a political conference could take place, where in essence, Mao Zedong becomes the de facto leader of the Chinese Communist Party, the Conference of Zunin in 1935. And this is, in essence, sort of acknowledging that his orientation towards the rural areas, towards guerrilla warfare, towards base areas, is the correct orientation. It is the future. It is the way we have to go as a party, first to survive and then to have any possibility of undertaking our objective, which is communist revolution. First, we need to survive, then we need to build. And it's at this moment when Mao will de facto become the leader of the CCP.